Hi, everyone. This is Drinks Presents Wine Online 101, a 10-part series for wineries to tackle an entirely new approach to expanding their businesses online. I'm Brandon Amoroso, founder and president of Electriq, a retention as a service e-commerce agency. And today, we're going to unpack all of the compliance issues that wineries need to consider when selling direct to consumer online. And for that, I'm joined by Kelly Martin, the Chief Compliance Officer of Drinks. Thanks for joining us today, Kelly. I can't think of a better person to walk us through the extremely complicated regulatory nuances of shipping direct to consumer in the US.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm really glad to be here.
So before we jump in here, could you actually just give everybody a quick background on your history in the wine industry? I think it would be sort of clarifying for everyone on why they should be listening to you on all of these things.
Sure. So I've been in the beverage alcohol industry for over 25 years. My entire career has been spent in this industry. I've had the opportunity of working in all of the various tiers, whether it's the producer supplier tier, as a wholesaler, importer, and even at the retail tier. Formerly, I came from one of the largest direct-to-consumer wine shipping companies, and they did the WSJ Wine Club, Lathwaite's Wine Club, etc. I've had experience not only on the wine side of things, but also in other beverage alcohol categories such as beer and spirits. So I've always said I kind of almost grew up in the industry. So as the industry changed and regulations and requirements changed as to how you could sell alcohol online, I've been able to adapt to that very quickly and broaden my experience.
That's awesome. I'm excited to dig in here with you. So let's start with just a quick overview of regulations and tax concerns that a winery needs to consider before selling direct to consumer. And I think it would probably be helpful if we start on the regulatory side and then move into tax, but whichever way you would prefer.
Sure. Well, I'd have to say they kind of go hand in hand. From a regulatory perspective, in order for, the industry change, the biggest change was after the Supreme Court case of Granholm, when wineries had the ability to be able to ship across state lines and sell direct to consumers. Prior to that, it was maybe what's called sometimes like transfer of title, where wineries would just charge tax in their state and then they shipped where they wanted to. And there wasn't a lot of enforcement back then. But with the Granholm case and wineries out of state being able to be treated the same as wineries in state by being able to ship, every state had to come into compliance with that. So most states set up a permit process where the winery will have to get a permit to ship to their state. And typically, with getting that permit, you then have to a lot of times sign up for sales or apply for sales tax applications as well, because the state didn't want to lose out on its revenue that they would typically make if the wine was going through the 3-tier system, which was the only other way wine was getting to consumers prior to opening the direct shipping part of it. So then once they have that, and again, depending on the state, each state came into compliance with it differently, with different rules and regulations. Some states, might only collect sales tax. Some states might even just charge like a completely separate, what we call alcohol tax. Some states might charge excise tax where others don't. So each state had its own set of rules. So it's very difficult for wineries to kind of get their head around all of these different rules and requirements that they needed to adhere to.
It sounds like you need a PhD in alcohol law to be able to ship direct to consumer. So most of this spawns out of the fact that after Prohibition, that each state was just sort of left to their own devices to create these rules and regulations, right?
Yes. So what came out of Prohibition was a 3-tier system, which I mentioned earlier, as well as each state had the right to regulate its own alcohol beverage industry.
Got it. And are there certain states that are more restrictive than others when it comes to shipping direct to consumer? Because I know, like Utah, for example, I don't think you can do it at all, but then there's other states that are a little bit more lenient.
Sure. So many states some states didn't even create like a permit system. And they didn't mind if it, it was almost the term what used to be used as reciprocity. If you allowed wineries to ship into their state to customers, reciprocity, they could ship to customers in the other state. So there's some that are simple as that. So there was no reporting that even had to be done. Then there's the ones that have the permits, and the type of reporting, the amount of reporting, and the monitoring of what you're doing varies by state. So a state like New York is going to be more restrictive than a state like California. So, each state has, in most cases, like volume limits on how much you can ship to customers, how much as a winery out of your total production or sales that you can actually ship versus like sell it through your tasting room. And then there's this other part of it, like I mentioned too, where some states have put in place taxes that are on top of sales tax that you have to be able to collect from the consumer and remit as well as the states didn't want to lose out on excise tax, which is typically at the wholesale tier. So that would be part of the requirement as a direct shipper that you have to remit that as well.
There is no shortage of taxes that are levied by the states apparently here. What happens when you aren't compliant, either from like a tax perspective or like you're shipping to somebody in a particular area where you're not supposed to? I'm assuming there's different ramifications for not being involved with or not toting the line with tax versus not following the compliance accurately.
Yeah, so typically compliance is regulated by the beverage alcohol agencies, which is in a lot of cases separate from the taxation agency within the state. So so you can run afoul of two different agencies. So typical sales tax, that's Department of Taxation. But then if you're looking at excise tax or some of the compliance rules about how much you've shipped in, et cetera, that's a different agency. And typically where the enforcement comes into play is the states have, like with the carriers, they've licensed the carriers, and those carriers have to submit reports as well as the winery, and they're matching them up. So by the tracking numbers, and they're matching that information up of what was shipped in and what the winery has reported. And that's how they're able to do enforcement. And they can then come back and say, oh, you shipped too much to this customer. And then once that's opened up, it's kind of like Pandora's box, because you have to prove differently. You have to convince that regulator that it was just an error. And if you've been doing it over a longer period of time, or you're just continuously doing that, that's where fines can be imposed, possibly even to the point, depending on how much you were not in compliance, that you could even lose your direct shipping permit.
So in terms of ramifications, is it fines? Is it just losing your permit? Is somebody going to go to jail? What are the real concerns here?
So I would say it's fines and losing the permit. Going to jail, I think that's a little bit of a reach there. It's not like, it's wine. It's not like we're selling some illegal substance or something like that. But the fines, if you're not in compliance, can start to add up. A lot of times you have to get legal counsel involved in it to handle it for you. And a lot of it is very subjective as to what they're going to charge you if there is a fine imposed. I think it's even an extreme case that typically you can work with the regulators. But again, this is it's a distraction from the business, a lot of time and effort to get through this. Like, for instance, a couple of years ago, the Texas TABC decided it was going to audit like hundreds of wineries, thousands of wineries that had direct shipping permits. So, and that just takes, and I was working with a winery at that time that it just takes up all your time, and they don't care that you have a business to run. So it's not only the financial aspect of it, but the time and energy that you have to put into it to kind of unwind if you if you weren't in compliance or you get into a sales tax audit, it's just a distraction from your business.
Yeah. And that's the last thing that you need when you're trying to grow and scale in your e-commerce presence, is having to worry about a particular regulator in a certain state. And I'm sure it opens up just a whole nother can of worms when it comes to that particular state. Once they find one thing, then you sort of move on throughout the rest. So I think for wineries, it would probably be best to err on the side of caution when it comes to anything related to tax and compliance, versus the sort of mantra of, what is it? Do something first, ask for forgiveness later. Yeah,
No,
I think maybe you should not be doing that when it comes to alcohol tax and compliance.
No, I agree with that. It's not, having experienced many investigations and audits in my career, it's not worth the time or effort to take that risk.
Yeah. So I think technology is something that is really, without technology, I don't know how you'd have any idea to be able to handle this with the 50 different states and each one having their own tax and compliance rules and regulations, and also their own reporting requirements. So how does Drinks use technology to address this in their day-to-day business?
Sure. So Drinks has its own properties that it manages, its own websites. And when I came on board in 2016, it was kind of a patchwork of trying to manage the compliance. And one of my first initiatives was to build and develop the technology that we didn't need to be monitoring all of this stuff. So even on our own property, Wine Insiders, as well as we host or do a program for like Macy's. Doing that, we're able to build in everything. So we were able to build our own tax tables, as well, to include alcohol tax as well, to make sure, like in states like New Hampshire, where general merchandise is 0%, but there's an 8% retail direct shipping tax that has to be passed on and collected from the consumer. So we built all of that in there. We've also, like I was talking about, consumer volume limits. We built by state, so we have all of those by state in there as well, so that if a customer has exceeded it, that they would not be able to place their order. So we're preventing those sales from going through. All the way through to bringing in-house of like all of the reporting and everything we need to do to submit the taxes and the direct shipping reporting. Age verification, we do that with a third party in real time. As well as like just, even the age gating. And then also, since our business is a little bit different from a winery, we have different compliance models we use in various states. So we have to really be, keep an eye on what products are sold in what states, depending on the compliance model that we're using. So we've also built that in too. So when a customer goes on and they choose the state they ship to, they only see products that are available and compliant in that state.
I think it is probably easier from a compliance and tax standpoint if you're just a winery shipping direct to consumer than it is if you're a Wine Insiders, for example, or a Macy's Wine or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, because a winery typically is just selling their own brands. One, they don't have the volume of products that our properties have. So I think that makes it a little bit easier. And then, we took from that and then took that knowledge and experience we had, and then we launched what we call our enterprise side of the business, which we call WAS, which is Wine as a Service. And we actually took all that functionality and then allowed other merchants and retailers to use it. So whether they're licensed like a Sam's Club, or whether they're unlicensed like just a merchant like Thrive Market, we allowed them to leverage that through an API, so that now they could offer wine as another category on their website as well.
I think that's super exciting, is the ability for any retailer that isn't in the alcohol industry to now be able to tap into what used to be gated behind all of these complex licensing and regulatory requirements. Now they can just work with Drinks and you can be up and running with your own wine own wine product and catalog.
Mhm.
So in terms of where the technology goes from here, I think when it comes to wineries, there's still quite a gap in the market when it comes to being able to provide like a really robust real-time solution for them. It'll be pretty interesting to see how that pans out over the next couple of months, even year, as it becomes more and more of a pressing issue for wineries to be able to ship direct to consumer. Because even 10 years ago, I didn't see many at all when it came to digitally native like wine brands launching. Whereas in the past 5 years, you look at everything from Shopify stores to like the commerce stores to own custom sites. It feels like there is a transition towards wineries recognizing that they need to have that online presence to be able to start to create direct relationships with their customers, and are starting to notice that, oh, this can actually not take away from our retail presence, but can be additive to it. And so as more and more demand comes from the wineries, I feel like there's going to be a lot of reg tech and tax solutions that come up and are able to service them in a way that really is not addressed in the market today.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I also think that wineries are recognizing, like you said, it's difficult, especially for small wineries. And that's where a lot of small producers, where the direct shipping laws came into play, is they didn't have access to markets. These big distributors are carrying how many brands, and to get access to the market, this allowed the wineries to do that. So I think they're also benefiting not only from getting to know their customer better, but I think there's also the financial benefit of it, not having to, like you said, it's not competing with maybe what they have in the brick and mortar stores, but it's another channel for them. And obviously there's probably higher margins for the winery in that channel as well.
Yeah. And I think it's really cool to be able to test products on your online storefront and then take data to retailers, because you're saying, oh, I don't know, certain type of rosé in Santa Rosa, California, we've already sold thousands of them. And we got 500 5-star reviews on the product. You should be carrying it in XYZ liquor store or whatever it may be. That is, and you just have so much more control too than just being one of 1,000 bottles on the shelf and hoping that you get placed into an area that is advantageous for you and your brand. And consumer education is a lot more difficult in person than it is online, with all the content that we can create, live selling, things like that. So before we close up here, is there anything else from a tax and compliance standpoint that a winery should be thinking about or know before or while they're shipping direct to consumer?
I would say that in recent couple years, there's been a lot more enforcement, a number of states. And so I think it's in their best interest to really stay on top of it and not take the risk.
I think I would agree with that. Don't ask for forgiveness, just do it right from the get-go.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. For everybody listening, just as a quick recap, in this session, we explored all the things that you need to consider regarding the regulation of wine when selling direct to consumer. As a winery going direct to consumer, there's a whole host of benefits to it, but you need to make sure that you're buttoned up from a tax and compliance standpoint to avoid fines, losing your licenses, or I guess if things really got crazy, you could hypothetically go to jail, but I'm not sure if that's happened. So don't quote me on that. But thank you everybody for listening. I'm sure you have questions about your particular situation. So just go ahead and mail us at wineries@drinks.com, and we'll go over whatever challenges you're facing and make sure that we can get you in a place where you're confident with your compliance and start shipping direct to consumer. So again, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.